This last part of discussing pain, we'll discuss social pain. The way we talk about social pain, whether it is social rejection or feeling for someone else or feeling hurt, we use the same kind of language that we use for physical pain. And so, of course, scientists were curious, is there some overlap between physical pain and feeling actual sensations on the body of pain and social pain? Some of the people who looked into this relatively early were Tanya Singer and her colleagues, and they looked at empathetic pain. So they had partners come in, and a woman came in with her male partner, and she either received shocks herself or she watched her male partner receive shocks. And what they found was that if the woman is receiving shocks herself, she has activation in the somatosensory cortex. But if she's receiving shocks, whether she's receiving the shocks herself or watching her male partner receive the shocks, they found activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. So as I talked about before with the hypnosis study, this idea that the anterior cingulate cortex, and especially the anterior insula, are involved with the affective components of pain. Those affective components of pain, those brain regions that are responding to our affective response to pain, they are responding whether I'm in pain myself or whether I'm feeling this kind of empathic pain, feeling for somebody else. They also had those participants, fill out empathy scales measuring their tendency to empathize with other people. And the higher their empathy scores, the higher the activation of the anterior cingulate cortex. So there was a correlation between how high they rated their empathy and the activation of this brain region. And I'm just repeating what I said before, but with pictures of brains, of activation of that somatosensory cortex up in the parietal lobes only when they receive shocks themselves, but the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula were activated in both conditions. And you can see in B that overlap of what we're going to say is the overlap between empathic pain and my affective component of how I'm responding to me receiving pain, physical pain myself. So there are different kinds of pain, and there are different kinds of social pain. So, for example, one is the distress or anguish over some social loss or some social stress. Naomi Eisenberger has been particularly interested in this feeling of social rejection. So she and her colleagues in 2003 led participants to believe that they were being excluded in a game. They created this cyberball game where what would happen was, at first, this was the computer pretending as if it was two different people playing, but what the participant is believing is that there are two other participants playing the cyberball game with them. And so those participants, he or she would see those participants playing the game, and then after a few throws, so that they figured out what they needed to do to play, those other participants, which is actually, again, the computer generated AI, they would include the participant who's in the fMRI, and then after a number of times where that person is included, they would then exclude that person and just start throwing the ball back and forth again. And so the assumption was this was leading people to feel some sense of social rejection. And what they found was activity in the anterior cingulate cortex in response to this social rejection. And what's being shown on the bottom there is actually they rated their feelings of personal distress, and the higher they rated their feelings of personal distress, the more activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. So there was a correlation there between their actual distress and the activation of this brain region. So there have been several studies in the early 2000s looking at this idea of the physical and social pain overlap. This has come to be known as the physical social pain overlap hypothesis. And Wu et al. In 2014, they went in and used a multivariate pattern analysis where, if you remember back to, we talked about this in object recognition, where they were looking at the visual cortex and they could look at the voxels. So not just the visual cortex in general or some region of the visual cortex, but they could go in and look voxel by voxel. And you can think of this as pixel by pixel on a screen, except this is a three-dimensional cubic millimeter of brain space. And they found that the voxel pattern was different when recalling social rejection by a romantic partner than the voxel pattern in response to painful heat on the forearm. So there's some overlap, but how much this overlaps and how exactly this overlaps is still being examined, as that really threw a monkey wrench into this physical social pain overlap hypothesis. And you will notice this is a particular kind of social rejection and a particular kind of heat. So this is going to take a while. This is one of those exciting areas of sensation and perception where it's still a big question and a big debate and a big controversy of how much do these really overlap.